going to have a discussion about voter ID. This is an ongoing issue across the country. A few preliminary matters. This is a CLE session, so if you want CLE credit, you should sign up in the back. There are also some handouts in the back if you're interested in having the handouts. And I believe Jenny has a USB drive if anybody wants paperless copies of the documents. The other thing I've been asked to mention, if anybody would like to receive information about states and election reform, NCSL elections team has prepared the canvas, and it's an email newsletter that comes out about once a month. So if you're interested in being on the distribution list, there's a sign-up sheet for that in the back as well. The session is being live streamed on NCSL's website and is also being recorded for later rebroadcast, or people can listen to it after the session. So please use the microphone for your questions. Also, if you're using the new NCSL meeting app, there is an ability to fill out a survey about this session at the conclusion of the session, so please fill out the survey on your app. The format of this session will be each speaker will have about 10 or 15 minutes to present their whatever they'd like to say on this issue, and then we'll spend the remainder of the time on questions. My name is Peggy Piety. I'm a staff attorney for the Indiana Legislative Services Agency, which is a nonpartisan staff agency. Assume that's why I was asked to be the moderator, because I'm the nonpartisan person on the panel. Currently, 32 states have laws in place that will require voters to show ID at the polls this November. Voter ID was the hottest topic for legislation in the field of elections in 2011. Legislation was introduced in 34 states, and only 3 states did not either have legislation introduced or have a voter ID law enacted. This continues into 2012. NCSL listed voter ID number 6 on its 12 hot topics for 2012. And in 2012, voter ID legislation continues to be a high-profile topic. Legislation is currently pending in 32 states, and in the last 2 years, 11 states have enacted new voter ID laws. So the discussion this morning will be, what do these laws mean for voters on Election Day? How will this legislation be implemented this year? What challenges do states face as they implement these laws? And how are courts interpreting these laws? Fortunately, we have a panel of distinguished speakers this morning to help us discuss and perhaps answer these questions. And I'm doing this in alphabetical order. The first speaker, Mr. J. Christian Adams. He is the Voter ID Task Force Chair for the Republican National Lawyers Association, and he's the founder of the Election Law Center, Virginia. He's in private practice and litigates a wide variety of election issues and has represented a number of presidential campaigns in 2012. He has served in the voting section at the United States Department of Justice and also as general counsel to the South Carolina Secretary of State. He has discussed election law issues in a variety of forums, including Fox News, CNN, NBC, CBS, NPR, Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, Laura Ingraham, and Roger Hedgecock. He is also a columnist, or has written columns for the Washington Times and the Washington Examiners. Mr. Adams is going to discuss voter ID from the national perspective of his organization's advocacy position. The second person is Senator Brenda Council on the end. She is an Omaha, Nebraska native. She's a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the Creighton University School of Law. In addition to the practice of law, Senator Council has established herself as a trailblazer in both the political and the civic arena. She is a member of the Omaha Board of Education for 11 years and the first African-American elected president of that board for 4 terms. In 1993, she was the first African-American woman elected to the Omaha City Council and has served as the Western Region Director of the National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials. In 2008, she was one of the first 2 African American women elected to the Nebraska unicameral, and during her freshman term, she was elected Vice Chair of the Business and Labor Committee and currently serves on the Judiciary and Education Committee. She has been an opponent of efforts to enact voter legislation law in Nebraska and will share her views on voter ID and on her Nebraska experience. The third speaker is Representative Patricia Harless. She was first elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 2006. She is in her 3rd term representing District 126, which is part of Northwest Harrison County. She serves on the Committee of State Affairs and Licensing and Administrative Procedures and the Redistricting Committee. She is also the owner of Fred Fincher Motors in Houston and is a lifelong resident of the area. Representative Harless is an active small business and civic leader, and she's the past president of the American Heart Association and has served on several other boards, including the Pearl Fincher Museum of Fine Arts, Cypress Woodlands Junior Forum, and the Lone Star College Foundation. She's also a member of the 100 Club of Houston, the Northwest Chamber of Commerce, and a lifetime member of the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. She is a graduate of Letourneau University, and she and her husband Sam are active members of the Champion Forest Baptist Church and are the parents of one son, also named Sam. She is the sponsor of Texas's 2011 voter ID legislation that has been blocked by the United States Department of Justice, and she will talk about the Texas experience with voter ID. Final speaker is Eric Marshall. He's the manager of legal mobilization for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law and is the chief organizer, creator, and manager of the infrastructure necessary to direct large-scale pro bono resources to address modern civil rights issues. He's also the co-leader of Election Protection, which is the nation's largest voter support coalition and directs various components of the program, including volunteer management, coalition building, online and offline communications, legal field programs, hotlines, and proactive problem solving. He has had a leading role in several election reform coalitions and has testified in support of election reform legislation before state and local legislative bodies and in favor of voting rights legislation at the federal level. He will discuss voter ID from the national perspective of his organization's advocacy positions. Number 1.
So while I pull the PowerPoint up, I just want to thank NCSL for providing me with this opportunity to talk about an issue that is impacting our democracy. I want to thank all of you in the audience for the incredible work you do on behalf of the American public, whether it be as public servants, staff members, or members of organizations. Of course, I talked and didn't pull the PowerPoint up. There we go. So I'm going to talk today about the issue of voter ID. Our Declaration of Independence stated all men are created equal. And this sense of fairness that undergirds our democracy is one of the reasons why our country is so great. That is why it is wrong to pass laws that make it difficult to impossible for responsible, eligible Americans to participate in our democracy. And especially because the justification behind these, voter impersonation, sorry, I'm moving closer to the microphone. Actually, I think the microphone is not on. Should I pull this one over? Let's try that again. There we go. So, again, I just want to thank everyone for being here today, for the great work that you do on behalf of the American public, and for NCSL for having me. Today I'm going to talk about an issue that's impacting our democracy. As I said, the Declaration of Independence provides that all men are created equal. And it's the sense of fairness that undergirds our democracy, that is one of the reasons why our country is so great. And that's why it's wrong to pass laws that make it impossible to or difficult for responsible, eligible Americans to participate in our democracy, especially when that justification for these laws, the impersonation of voters at the polling place, not electoral fraud like absentee ballots, vote buying, using the machinery of elections to rig elections, that are problematic in some segments of this country, not about those, but actual impersonation of voters is virtually non-existent, and I'll get into that as well. And finally, and I'll conclude with the fact that one of the shames of this debate is that it's distracting us from the real problems and the real solutions. We have the greatest democracy in the world, but there are cracks in that foundation, and we should be working together in a bipartisan fashion for real solutions to the real problems, and I'll suggest a few in my closing. So I imagine that everybody in this room probably has a government-issued photo ID. I imagine you all have driver's licenses. I also imagine the majority of you, only a few of you probably know somebody who lacks ID. But I think you can also give me that this room is not a representative sample size of the American public as a whole. And throughout the course of the last few years, we've seen more and more stories that back up the studies that show that real, responsible, eligible Americans are negatively impacted by requiring specific government-issued photo ID in order to vote. People like Vivian Applewhite, who is a Philadelphia native born in 1919, widow, grandmother, great-grandmother, someone who's voted in nearly every election since 1960. Ms. Applewhite marched with MLK in Macon, Georgia for the cause of civil rights. She had a purse stolen a few years ago that included her ID. She's retired, she doesn't drive, she didn't get a new driver's license. When Pennsylvania passed the law, Ms. Applewhite did her civic duty, tried to get an ID, but she couldn't get a birth certificate, and the government could not track down that birth certificate. If Pennsylvania's law is to stand this November, Ms. Applewhite will not be able to vote. How about Carl Ellis, a veteran of the United States Army, lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, lives in a homeless shelter for veterans, does not have a driver's license. He does have a photo ID issued by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. That identification card is not allowed to vote in the state of Wisconsin under its law. He does not have his Illinois birth certificate, and because he's homeless, cannot afford to get a certified copy of his Illinois birth certificate. Mr. Ellis will not be able to vote this November if the state's law is allowed to stand. And the numbers nationwide back up the fact that Mr. Ellis and Ms. Applewhite are not alone. Nationwide, 11% of eligible U.S. citizens lack government-issued photo ID, 18% of senior citizens over the age of 65, and 25%, a quarter, of African-American voters. If you look at states, those numbers are just as representative. In Pennsylvania, 750,000 registered Pennsylvania voters lack the documentation required under the new law. If you add in eligible voters, that number jumps to 1.3 million. But of that 750,000, 379,000 lack the documentation to get the ID, and of that number, 174,000 actually voted in the 2008 elections. I also add that during the trial around Pennsylvania's identification law, the state admitted that there is zero evidence of voter impersonation in the state of Pennsylvania. For those who say that the photo ID laws are simple policy prescriptions, I give you Carol H.O., the Secretary of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who during the trial noted that she did not understand what was in the law. If the chief election official of the state of Pennsylvania can't explain what the law contains, how can the poll workers that are supposed to implement this law understand it fully? How can they be trained accurately to implement that law? And how can the American public understand what's in these laws? And the fact of the matter is they can't. Matt Barretto, a poli-sci professor at the University of Wisconsin, did a study of the law and found out that 1/3 of Pennsylvania voters didn't even know, and this is in June, after the state had a soft rollout of the law in April, 1/3 of the voters in Pennsylvania did not know that there was a law change. When questioned further, 99% initially said, oh yeah, I qualify, I can vote. But when the law was explained to them, 12% actually couldn't. So if they don't know that they don't qualify to vote and they don't know the law has changed, how are they going to comply with the law? And it's quite clear when you actually peel back the layers of the onion of these laws why there's so much confusion. In Texas, a gun license is allowed to vote under the state's law, but not a photo ID issued by the University of Texas. Wisconsin fortunately allows student IDs from public universities to be allowed. But for four-year institutions, that ID needs to have a 2-year expiration date. At the time the law passed, not a single four-year institution did that. And I might add that no other identification that's required under the law in Wisconsin has such restrictions on the expiration dates. In Tennessee, Faculty at the University of Tennessee can use their employee ID to vote, but the students they teach cannot use their student ID issued by the same university in order to vote. So this isn't a matter of simply putting a regime in place to ensure that voters identify themselves at some point in time throughout the process. Because the fact of the matter is the vast majority of the states already have those systems in place, and they have been effective. This is about specific types of ID with specific prescriptions that limit access to our democracy. Now, of course, I think it's quite clear from the stories of Ms. Applewhite and Mr. Ellis that getting this free ID isn't simple or easy. In the case of Mrs. Applewhite, it's impossible for her to get it. In the case of Mr. Ellis, he can't afford it. In most states, the backup documents cost real money. A birth certificate, if you don't have one, it costs upwards of $35 to $50 to get one. You need that to get a government-issued photo ID. That means that a single mother, low-income mother, who doesn't have a birth certificate has to decide whether or not she wants to feed her children or get the documents to vote. No mother should have that decision to exercise the most fundamental right to vote. And getting ID is as easy as going to the DMV. Well, if you've been to the DMV, you know that it's not easy. States across the country have been limiting hours and access to DMVs. A recent study by the Brennan Center for Justice noted that ID issuing offices are an average of 10 miles away from people who need it the most, and the public transportation systems are lacking. In fact, in 7 of the 10 states that have strict government-issued photo ID laws, they rank in the bottom of states for public transportation funding. If you don't have photo ID, you don't have a driver's license, you can't drive, you need public transportation or a friend or family member to get there. If hours are limited, especially weeknight and weekend hours, which they are in many DMVs, it becomes even more difficult to get to the DMV. And then the idiosyncrasies of how to even get of the hours of the DMV are vastly confusing. Look at Sauk City, Wisconsin. The ID issuing office for Sauk City, Wisconsin is only open on the 5th Wednesday of every month, which there were 4 of those in 2012, one of which was February 29th. Thank God for leap year. So it's not as simple as people like to say, and I think that this slide kind of really illustrates the problems in terms of getting the free ID. Now, it's important, as I noted before, to break down what photo ID stops. It stops me walking into a polling place and saying I'm somebody else and getting a ballot and voting. It's virtually non-existent, any evidence of that. Before the trial in Pennsylvania, the state, in defending the law, said there is no evidence of voter impersonation in the state of Pennsylvania. We will not bring any evidence to its existence at trial, and we do not expect any voter impersonation in the state of Pennsylvania during the 2012 elections. You all have a copy of the Marion County lawsuit, the Crawford versus Marion County Supreme Court decision. The proponents of photo ID brought forward over 250 cases of voter electoral fraud to justify the law. A careful analysis of every one of those cases showed that there were only 9 potential cases of voter impersonation. It could have been clerical error, it could have been someone voting in the wrong line, but 9 potential instances. For argument's sake, let's say that all 9 of those cases were in fact voter impersonation. During that same time period, 400 million ballots were cast. That's an effective rate of voter impersonation of 0.0000002%. Put that in context, during that same time period, 32,299 people saw UFOs. 352 people were struck by lightning, and there were 9 possible instances of voter impersonation. And that really is the root of this debate. The proponents of the laws continue to put forward electoral fraud, which I fully admit needs to be addressed. Absentee ballot fraud, vote buying, electoral malfeasance. The Republican National Lawyers Association had a map about voter fraud across the country to justify the law. When you actually peeled back and looked at all the cases on that map, there's only one potential case in Tennessee involving 3 people that could have been voter impersonation. So if voter impersonation was such a mass problem, then why do proponents always bring up fraud that is not voter impersonation? Why don't they bring evidence of voter impersonation if it's such a widespread problem? The fact of the matter is, there are vastly more efficient ways to steal an election. Even the closest elections come down to, say, 50 votes. Margin of error, you need to probably steal 75 to 100 votes to steal an election. To do that impersonation, that means you need to get a list of 75 people. You need to walk into a community polling place in front of that community, many small towns across the country, with poll workers who are most likely members of that community. You need to know that that person was not removed from the rolls or put on an inactive list before Election Day, that did not vote absentee. You need to stand there confidently, state the name and address in front of people who may know that voter, poll workers who may know that voter, all the while risking up to $10,000 in fines and 5 years in prison. And repeat that exercise at 75 to 100 polling places across a small jurisdiction. That is why it's virtually non-existent. You see this kind of voter impersonation fraud. And the fact of the matter is the policies in place have been effective at preventing it. So what do we lose here in this debate? As I mentioned before, we live in the greatest democracy in the world, but there are cracks in our infrastructure that need to be repaired. Chief among them is our antiquated, paper-based, inefficient, costly system of voter registration that was invented in the 19th century by the Whig Party. It is not only inefficient, but it also continues to exclude responsible Americans from the system. Nearly more than a quarter of voting-age citizens in the United States are not registered to vote. We need to be talking about that. We need to be talking about the fact that voter registration rolls contain over 12 million errors due to moving and list problems. That means that mailings are most likely not going to reach their target. Requiring specific government-issued photo ID does not do anything to address that problem. It also does not stop another kind of fraud being perpetrated against voters across this country, deceptive election practices that we're seeing more and more across this country, like flyers telling voters, looking like it's come from the Commonwealth of Virginia, saying members of one party vote on Wednesday, members of the other party vote on Tuesday. So what should we really be talking about? We should be talking about modernizing registration, using 21st century technology for a system that's automatic, is permanent, that moves with you. Because when you move, your ATM card moves with you. Why doesn't your voter registration card move with you? That will create an accurate, secure voter registration roll that will allow more access to voters, save election officials millions of taxpayer dollars, and allow them to do the work they want to do, which is training poll workers, setting up polling places, and really administering elections as opposed to doing data entry. We also need to make the deception of voters about the time, place, manner, or method of voting unambiguously illegal. So I hope that after this election we can come together in bipartisan fashion to work together on the solutions to the real problems that impact voters. I look forward to the conversation, the Q&A with all of you. I want to put forward a way to connect with us virtually on Twitter, on Facebook, and on the website. And if folks are happy to grab me after the session and talk, but I want to thank you for your time and look forward to the conversation. Thank you. I think we're going down the line.
Right. Nope. I guess we'll go right down the line. My name's Christian Adams. I'm afraid that the only thing we might agree on today, for you folks standing in the back, there's a couple of seats up here you might possibly want. But other than that, we're probably not going to have many areas of agreement. I would venture to say that there has not been so much unwarranted hysteria in public discourse in this country since perhaps 1692, when Goodwife Proctor was accused of being a witch in Salem, Massachusetts. And I mean that seriously because there are so many myths associated with voter ID that it really has poisoned the discourse. And what I'm going to do today is go through some of these myths and debunk them one by one. But I want to emphasize that I also think that this issue is being exploited to scare people, not always from one side, I might add. This, in my view, is more about heat than it is light. It is more about mobilizing a base than it is actual real concerns. But it is tragic when legislation, as your job is to make, is influenced in the future by some of these myths that I'm going to address today. If any of you all are from Alabama, you know who Arthur Davis is. And Arthur Davis was a Democrat congressman who was in the House of Representatives, an African American, who in about 2008, 2009 would have stood up and delivered the exact sort of speech you just heard. And he was a voter ID opponent. He was a vote fraud denier. And he will tell you now in 2011, as he is now doing around the country, this former congressman from Alabama, that this is not a billy club. That's his term. He says, this is not Jim Crow. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. My family knows a thing or two about fire hoses and Jim Crow and billy clubs. This is not it. This is a driver's license. And to scare people into thinking that civil rights are under attack because of voter ID, frankly, I think does a great deal of damage to the discourse in this country. So let me pick up on some of these myths that I'm going to talk about. The first one is that voter ID infringes on a fundamental right. This is not true to the extent that not a single court in the United States has ever reached this conclusion. That includes the Supreme Court. That includes the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. It also includes the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, the most liberal court in the country, at least in the federal circuits. So there is not a single court decision in this nation that has ever held that voter ID infringes on a fundamental right. To the contrary, as a matter of fact, in Crawford versus Marion County, a case which I understand you all have, the court not only upheld the constitutionality of voter ID against a challenge, but it also said something very important for all of you. And that is that there need not be rampant, massive, widespread, all of the buzzwords that the voter ID opponents like to say, evidence of voter fraud. Indeed, legislators can enact prophylactic legislation in advance of any manifest problems. And Justice Stevens, hardly a lion of the right, articulated this view, that you have wide power to enact prophylactic legislation even if you don't have an existing problem. Let's do a little exercise in words. Let's substitute the absence of massive, widespread, rampant, pervasive, virtually non-existent, or as we heard, only 9 instances of voter fraud, with perhaps the word larceny, or murder, or terrorism. And would you ever in your right mind as a legislator say, well, there's only 9 instances of murder, therefore we don't need to outlaw it, there's only 9 instances of fraud, there's virtually non-existent terrorism. The point is, these are crimes against the integrity of our system. Our constitutional republic relies on the consent of the governed, and the belief of those governed that their vote was not diluted by a criminal. Let me deal with the next myth on voter ID. The myth is that this is a partisan, conservative, ALEC conspiracy around the country. It is not. Ask the Democratic legislators from Rhode Island who sponsored voter ID in Rhode Island, Senator Metz, as well as the overwhelming Democrats' support in the House and Senate of Rhode Island, which enacted voter ID. Ask the majority of Kansas Democrats who supported voter ID and citizenship verification this last legislative session in Kansas. This is a bipartisan issue. It is bipartisan when you do polling, when you collect polling data. 80% of Americans support voter ID, and that majority includes whites, blacks, Democrats, Republicans, independents. Across the board, as legislators, you will not lose by supporting voter ID. The next myth, that this leads to massive disenfranchisement. One of the favorite studies to be cited is a study by a group which I will warn you, you should never take seriously. It is the Brennan Center for Justice. Here are the details of this study. They said that millions of people lack voter ID. To reach this conclusion, they had a whopping sample size of 987 adults who were not even registered voters. One of the questions was, in this study, could you quickly find, their words, the supporting documentation to prove you're a citizen? Quickly find. I couldn't, for sure. It's somewhere in my basement. But I could not quickly find it. Even better, here's the methodology of this study that's so often cited by the opponents of voter ID. 14% of the respondents said they both had a birth certificate, a United States birth certificate, and naturalization papers. Completely mutually exclusive responses. But that's the methodology of the corrupt Brennan Center study. It cannot be trusted. The next myth of voter ID is that it reduces turnout. That is a myth. The University of Missouri found that in Indiana, after the passage of voter ID, turnout increased 2%. The University of Delaware and the University of Nebraska did a comprehensive study of the election cycles 0, 2, 4, and 6, and found that voter ID had absolutely no impact on reducing turnout. American University surveyed registered voters, unlike the Brennan Center, and found that less than half of 1%, didn't have photo ID. So you have to look at the methodology of some of these folks who are saying these things. Next myth, voter impersonation doesn't exist. This one always rankles me a little bit because when I was at the Justice Department, I litigated this in federal court. I'll give you a citation. It's 494 F sup 2nd 440. The case is out of the Southern District of Mississippi, United States versus Ike Brown. The witness, I heard laughs. That means somebody knows Ike Brown. The witness, he's a good guy. I hope he's doing better, by the way. He had a stroke. The witness that the Justice Department presented testified that Mr. Brown was encouraging people, they heard Mr. Brown encouraging people to vote under a false name without showing ID because, quote, you won't get caught, there's no voter ID. So to say that it doesn't exist is simply not true. What's interesting, the same Brennan Center for Justice that's so relied upon issued a voter fraud report in November of 2007 called The Truth About Voter Fraud that never included the findings of voter fraud that were in the federal court opinion. So it's very difficult to take the Brennan Center for Justice seriously. Let me close on this last point. We heard that it's more likely you get struck by lightning than to have voter impersonation. Well, according to the National Weather Service, the last person to be struck by lightning in West Virginia was in 2005. But since 2005, the sheriff of Lincoln County, West Virginia, has pled guilty to voter fraud, forging absentee ballots. Voter fraud convictions of West Virginia are rampant, especially in the southern coal fields. So we have more voter fraud than we have lightning strikes in West Virginia. And I could go on in other states. It's not just West Virginia. So these are some of the myths about voter ID that I hope you as legislators going forward will consider to be myths. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for having us here today, and thank you for your interest in this subject. I agree with both of the prior panelists that this is an issue that separates, and it really shouldn't always separate us. Sometimes we have to agree to disagree. In Texas, this was our third attempt at trying to pass a photo voter ID. We tried in the 2007, the 2009 session, and then we passed it in 2011. SB 14 was modeled after the Indiana legislation that was approved through the U.S. Supreme Court, the opinion that they have in the back of the room. And it was also modeled after the Georgia legislation, which Georgia, like Texas, is a Section 5 pre-clearance state. And Georgia's legislation was approved by the Department of Justice in 2005. We wanted to make sure that we protected the integrity of our election process by asking people to prove you are who you say you are when you show up to vote in person. And the safeguards that we put in our legislation said that individuals would show an ID, approved ID, prior to voting. Those types of approved ID are issued by the Department of Public Safety, which usually includes an ID card, a Texas ID card, or a Texas driver's license. We also included a concealed handgun license because in Texas we all carry our guns very proudly. And we included citizenship papers with your picture on it and a military ID or a passport. If you did not have one of the approved forms of ID, the Department of Public Safety would provide you with a free ID certificate or election card free of charge. Access to the polls were important to us. We also put some exceptions into our legislation that allowed that if you show up at the poll and didn't have any one of the approved forms of ID, you could cast a provisional ballot, and at that point you have 6 days to return to the clerk's office and prove that you are who you say you are. So everybody has an opportunity to vote if they showed up at the polls and didn't have the ID with them. We also provided an exemption for disabled voters. And if you did not have a photo ID and you were disabled and you were receiving benefits from the federal government under their standards for being disabled, then you were allowed to cast a vote without a photo ID. In Texas, we also have ballot by mail provisions. If you're going to be out of your home address when the election takes place, you can do a ballot by mail. If you're over 65, you can do a ballot by mail. And if you're disabled, you can do a ballot by mail. So those options were still available, trying to make it easy for anyone that was disabled or elderly to still vote in the same way that they've always voted in the past. There's a lot of talk about this being a partisan issue and impacting minorities disappropriately. In Texas, we passed this legislation with 101 votes to 48. Of that, we had 6 Hispanic Republican members vote for the legislation, 2 African American members, Republican members, vote for the legislation, and 1 Asian member vote for the legislation. We also had 2 Democratic colleagues vote for the legislation. So it had wide support in Texas. The governor signed the legislation and we started the pre-clearance application process. The Attorney General chose to go to the Department of Justice for pre-clearance. We submitted that application in July, and in March they turned down our application for pre-clearance. We knew that they were dragging their feet and asking for information that was impossible to compile. So our AG at that point in January went ahead and filed suit in the federal courts asking for immediate enforcement of our photo ID. 3-judge panel was assembled and we had that trial July the 9th through the 13th. We are currently waiting on the results of that trial, which should be by the end of August, so that we can hopefully implement this legislation for the November elections. Part of the legislation said that there would be intense training for all the election judges and that the information would be widely available prior to coming time to vote. Some of the facts that we found from the fraud, from the trial, because there's a lot of media negative publicity about how Texas bill would disenfranchise people. In the 18 months since we passed it, the Department of Justice went on a strong search for at least one person that they could use as a witness that would be disenfranchised, and they were unable to find that one person in Texas on a very extensive search for 18 months. But facts that did come out in the trial is that Texas had more than 50,000 dead people registered to vote on their current rolls, that at least 239 dead people voted in our May primary election we just held this year, and 213 of those people voted in person. Senator Tommy Williams, a senator in Texas who's done great work in election and works a lot with the DPS, said that his great-grandfather had ballots cast in his name for years after he was deceased. His grandmother every year tried to get his voter registration taken off the rolls, and he was still casting ballots. The states that have enacted their voter identification for in-person voting, Indiana and Georgia, have seen increases in participation since these bills have been enacted. And the increase in participation in Georgia has been a greater increase in minority votes than other votes. And that just solidified to us that people when they have confidence in the election, when they know that their vote counts, they're more likely to show up and vote. Let me talk a little bit about some of the elections in Texas. Since 2004, there's been 6 Texas House elections that have been decided by less than 50 votes. In 2010, Representative Donna Howard won her recount by 12 votes. 2010 Democratic primary, Representative Boris Miles won by 8 votes. In 2011 general election cycle, Representative Linda Harper Brown won by 19 votes. 2008 Republican primary, Representative Doug Miller won by 17 votes. 2006 Republican primary, Nathan Messia won by 46 votes. 2004 election, general election, Hubert Vo won by 33 votes. Every vote counts. It's important that if you show up to vote at a poll, that you prove you are who you say you are, so that that vote isn't cast, it doesn't disqualify a legitimate vote. And thank you again for having us.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to take my few minutes to share with you the experience in the great state of Nebraska, which I am proud to say is one of the few states that defeated a voter photo ID bill during this most recent legislative session. And allow me to place it in some context, because we hear the discussion about myths, we hear the discussions about whether it's partisan or nonpartisan. The bill that was introduced in Nebraska was the identical bill that was introduced in Indiana, which was the identical bill that was circulated by ALEC to ALEC members. So whether or not you agree that the bill itself is a valid piece of legislation, the fact remains that those were the pattern bills that were introduced. The bill that was introduced in Nebraska initially, again, was the identical bill that was introduced in Indiana. And the sponsor of the bill did not appreciate all of the impact of the Indiana legislation, in particular, the portion of the Indiana legislation that required the state to make state-issued photo identification free. In our budget times, to take into consideration making provision for free photo identification state-issued was not contemplated, so the committee that addressed that particular bill, and the chairman of the committee is present here today and can confirm, removed that portion of the bill that provided for the state to provide free photo identification. So the bill that actually was advanced to the full body, and for those of you who are not aware, Nebraska is the only unicameral legislature in the nation. We only have one House, a Senate. We have 49 senators. So when the bill comes out of the committee, it does, in fact, go to the full body. And this bill was introduced at the same time that a bill was introduced to eliminate another distinction that Nebraska has, and that is being one of 2 states that have split electoral college votes. Only Maine and Nebraska allow their electoral college votes to be split, meaning it's not a winner-take-all state. And coincidentally, in 2008, for the first time since 1964, one of Nebraska's electoral college votes went to a Democratic presidential candidate, because that candidate won the popular vote in a congressional district where the predominant minority representation resides in the state of Nebraska. Perhaps coincidence. That effort occurred at the same time as photo ID. But the fact remains, not myth, the fact remains that the data in Nebraska showed that more than 100,000 registered voters in Nebraska did not have the photo ID that would have been required by the bill. And that would have been a driver's license or a state-issued identification card. In the district that I represent in Omaha, Nebraska, data shows that more than 25% of the residents don't own or have access to a vehicle, but more significantly, a greater percentage of those residents don't have state-issued identification. And I know it's easy for many of us to say, well, that's inexcusable. There shouldn't be any problem with you obtaining a state-issued photo identification. But similar to the situation with Ms. Applewhite, there are a number of residents, particularly elderly African Americans, who do not have, nor have they ever had, a birth certificate. Many of them were birthed at home, do not have birth certificates, but they have been registered voters for decades and have exercised their right to vote for decades. And under a law similar to the one introduced in Nebraska and passed in other states, those individuals would have been deprived the right to continue to vote. Now, Mr. Adams has accurately stated that there is no federal court decision finding that photo ID is unconstitutional. But I submit to you that you also have to look at your state constitutions. And the Constitution of the state of Nebraska expressly prohibits any hindrance on the exercise of the right to vote by a qualified voter. And a qualified voter is defined as someone who is duly registered to vote. So if you're a duly registered voter in Nebraska, there should be no hindrance to your ability to exercise that right to vote. Now, none of us on this panel or out there wants to do anything to place any impediment on the integrity of our electoral process. But nor do I submit that any of us want to unduly burden individuals in the exercise of their right to vote. And if you look at some of the voter photo ID laws and you look at whether the intent is really carried out in that legislation, if the integrity of the process is what is at stake, then I would question why there are distinctions in many of these bills between people who decide to vote in person and people who vote by mail. And when you vote by mail in Nebraska, you don't have to show a photo ID. And in fact, most of the election officials in the counties in Nebraska want to move to mail ballot elections. We have a law currently in place in Nebraska that certain counties with low populations can conduct all mail ballot elections. So under the bill that was introduced in Nebraska, if you had the distinction of living in a sparsely populated county, you would never have to show your photo identification to vote. But if you lived in a densely populated county in Nebraska where all mail ballot elections weren't permitted and you decided to appear in person to vote and did not have a photo ID, you would be deprived of the right to vote. Now, I ask you, what is the difference? Why is a mail ballot perceived as being a more protective and a process that is less open to fraud than in-person voting? I submit to you that the other presents a greater risk of voter fraud when you don't have to present ID to vote by mail. When you talk about access to that kind of data and voter registration information, I'm going to submit to you that it's much easier to cast a mail ballot instead of the person who is duly registered than to appear in person to cast that person's ballot and to face the risk of a felony prosecution and a $10,000 fine. So if you drill down to what is really at issue here with voter identification, again, I respect and want to preserve the integrity of the voting process. I have seen far too many elections decided by less than 50 votes. So most assuredly, you want to be sure that the people who are voting have a right to vote. But I do not believe that photo identification is the way to accomplish that. If we would address our voter registration processes, modernize them, make them easier. One of the examples that Representative Harless gave was about the number of people who still appear on their voter registration polls who are deceased. Well, is that a photo ID issue or is that a voter registration issue? I think we can address those problems and those difficulties without unduly burdening individuals who have a constitutional right to vote, burdening them by requiring that if they don't have identification, that they are either going to have to vote provisionally, which places their ballot at risk, or they have to go through, in many cases, like Ms. Applewhite's case, a process that there is no relief at the end for them because they won't be able to obtain a birth certificate, they won't be able to obtain a photo ID. The same situation existed under the Nebraska bill with regard to students. They have a state university system, yet their university-issued photo identification didn't satisfy the photo ID requirement. And if they were out-of-state students who had properly registered in the state of Nebraska, established their residence, registered to vote, but had a driver's license from another state, they wouldn't be permitted to vote under the bill that was introduced in Nebraska. I'm proud to say that I was part of a filibuster of the photo ID bill in Nebraska, and that filibuster was successful. There were not enough votes to advance that piece of legislation, and if it's reintroduced in the next session, we'll undertake the same filibuster because, again, at the hearing, and the chairman of the government committee can either confirm or deny it, we had county election officials who testified against the photo ID bill. Our Secretary of State admitted that there was no evidence of voter fraud or voter impersonation in the state of Nebraska that would warrant the type of legislation that was going to impose the kinds of burdens that the photo ID bill was going to impose upon qualified voters in the state of Nebraska. And with that, I'll conclude my comments and await the questions.
Okay, now it's your turn. Anybody who would like to ask a question needs to move to a microphone because the session's being recorded.
My name is Danny Wells. I'm a delegate from West Virginia. Mr. Adams, how would voter ID affect absentee ballots?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm currently counsel in a case in Minnesota that is before the Minnesota Supreme Court, where, and by the way, the senator has a great point. I think vote by mail and absentee ballots are a rat's nest of fraud. I litigated that issue too at Justice. And so what they did in Minnesota to deal with this, as they did in Kansas in the legislation that became the law, is attempt to extend identification requirements to the mail-in side. In the Kansas solution, it's essentially, and we can get into the details another time, but to add your voter registration number to your ballot, your envelope, so you prove you use a form of ID in the Kansas model of mail-in ballot. In the Minnesota version, which is a constitutional amendment, which may or may not be on the ballot in November, those absentee mail voters will have to comply with a substantial equivalency identification requirement, which may mean writing your driver's license number down, your voter license number on your absentee ballot. But what's interesting is we hear people say how bad mail-in ballot problems are. You ought to be looking at that issue. As soon as Kansas and Minnesota did that, they were attacked by the same people who normally attack voter ID. So there are solutions out there for absentee ballot fraud. Frankly, the one nobody wants to do is get rid of absentee ballots. But that would clear up the problem of voter fraud and absentee ballots, of which, by the way, your state, unfortunately, has a particular problem with, as you probably know.
Yes, I do. But that was absentee ballot problem. So
that's right. And if you added something, you wouldn't have the sheriff of Lincoln County, whose name escapes me right now, sitting there with a stack of phony absentee ballots, voting them in the names of other people, if he actually had to put some identifying number on those envelopes.
This nuance is just muddying the debate, because during my overview, I talked about the fact that there were only 9 cases of potential voter impersonation, and to rebut that claim, Mr. Adams talked about absentee ballot fraud. I didn't talk about electoral fraud. I talked about voter impersonation, and that's the problem with this debate because you muddy the waters. His second example was about someone who heard an official encourage other people to vote in someone else's name.
And that was
yet
testified
there was
under
no,
oath.
hold on, excuse me.
You can read it in the Federal District Court opinion.
Mr. Adams, I did not interrupt you, so if you
wasn't
could
just a
please
rumor.
allow me to speak, I would appreciate that. Thank you very much. He did not bring forward any actual evidence of ballots voted in someone else's name in that case.
Actually, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true.
If it was true, then why didn't
And it's
you
not
cite it?
hearsay either. It's an admission of a party opponent. It's not hearsay.
I'm still waiting for the example.
I mean, it was the case. I'll read the citation. You can read it. It's 494 F sub 2nd, 440, Southern District of Mississippi, 2007.
Mr. Marshall, you want to continue with your answer?
I mean, that's basically my answer. It goes back to the initial point, is the fact that we're talking about voter impersonation. We're not talking about electoral fraud. And so when we talk about existence of issues, we should be talking about the actual impersonation of voters, not absentee ballot fraud. It's a false debate that distracts from the real problems, and that's simply what I was trying to point out in the debate, is if it was such a massive problem, there's so many issues, then why can't proponents of these laws continue to point to concrete examples of actual voter impersonation?
Well, they do, but you move the goalposts. First you want any, then you want massive, then you want widespread conspiracies, and you keep changing the terms of the debate. Anytime somebody presents evidence that this occurs, the goalposts move. And that is something that I think, frankly, you don't need any evidence. You guys can pass legislation because you want to protect the integrity of the system, and Justice Stevens clearly said this in Crawford. Even if there's no evidence, you can still pass legislation.
I asked for any. And talk about moving goalposts.
I did. I gave a citation, 494 F sub 2nd, 440.
Let's take another question unless Representative Harless or Senator Council have anything to add. We'll take another question.
I just want to add, the case, the Marion case does say, even if there's no evidence, but what I think my colleague, Mr. Adams, neglects to point out, that it did speak to the level of burden imposed, and even if there's no evidence, but there is significant evidence that it imposes a burden on the exercise of the right to vote, I think the constitutionality of such legislation is suspect.
Except you flip the term in the court opinion. It's significant burden, not significant evidence of burden. And look, this is the hard issue here for legislators. When does it make good public policy to enact photo ID? There are, in fact, economic questions, and nobody here at this table, with the possible exception of the two ladies on my left, can answer. And this is the harder question. But to deny that vote fraud occurs is simply disingenuous.
Okay, let's take another question. Anybody else?
Sure. My name is Roman Buehler. I was, for 14 years, a committee counsel for Congress and was there when Congress dealt with this issue. One of the proposals made was a proposal to require a government-issued photo ID, but to allow voters who did not have such an ID to sign an affidavit stating who they were, so that if there were a close election, those votes could be investigated. Unfortunately, in my view, that proposal was defeated on a party line vote. So my question to Eric Marshall and to Brenda Council is if there were such a proposal to require government-issued photo ID but to allow anyone to vote if they signed their name on an affidavit, would you support such a proposal, or are you opposed to even that kind of limited voter ID requirement? Thank you.
We're not opposed to ensuring that people identify who they say they are and verify identity at the polling place. And states across the country have various proposals to do that. What we oppose is when it's a strict government-issued photo ID law that only requires specific documentation in order to vote without the ability of a voter who lacks documentation. And as I pointed out in my overview that was neglected in Mr. Adams' presentation, real voters like Mrs. Viviette Applewhite or Carl Ellis, who are numerous across the country, who can't vote because of these laws during varying circumstances, the ability to cast a ballot. So if there is that option and it is evenly enforced and it's made available to every voter to be able to sign an affidavit and still vote a regular ballot, then yes, that is a solution that ensures the integrity of elections but also provides an avenue for responsible, eligible Americans who want to participate in our democracy for the ability to do so.
And just my response, I would be supportive of that type of option with proper education, so that there's no suggestion to the public that if you appear at the polls without a vote, without an ID, you can't vote. One of the, again, the difficulties with some of the legislation that's been enacted is you pass these laws and you make the changes and you have all of these exceptions, and then you don't provide the proper education to the voters so that they can determine whether or not they fit within one of the exceptions and can go cast their vote. It's like the nursing home exception. Some of these bills provide for a nursing home exception. Well, wonder if you're unfortunately in a position where you can't afford to place your elderly parent in a nursing home and they live with you and they don't have photo identification. What makes the fact that you reside in a state licensed facility a greater protector of the integrity of the vote than if you live at home with your children because you can't afford to stay in a state licensed facility? Those are some of the problems with these many exceptions that are built into some of these bills on photo ID.
Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is Representative Eddie Pashinsky from the great state of Pennsylvania, where we just went through the voter ID legislative process, and House Bill 934 was passed based upon voter identification fraud. I'd just like to share a few things with you, and you can draw your own conclusions. We just had 7 days of testimony in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, and during that time our Secretary of State admitted that there were no cases of voter identification fraud. Also, the premise that the voter identification fraud in Pennsylvania legislation was necessary, they indicated, the State Department, that there was less than 1% of the voting population in Pennsylvania that would be affected by this. That would be somewhere around 75,000 people. Through testimony, it was found out that over 758,000 people would not qualify under the law that was passed. And I don't believe there's anybody in this room that would not fight and not work hard to prevent voter fraud. All of us want one person, one vote to count. But in that same premise, one of the major problems that we see not only in Pennsylvania but throughout this country is this immediacy of passing this law now and making it work for November of 2012. I'm not opposed to having us identify who we are at the poll. We all should. But what I am vehemently opposed to is if one American citizen that has the right to vote will be denied because of a law that has been rushed through. I'm suggesting to you that we go through this process very deliberately and make sure that we don't deny anybody their right to vote in November. We in Pennsylvania tried to incorporate time frames so that there would be enough time to make sure there would be sufficient outreach to extend to every Pennsylvanian citizen the opportunity to get the right identification to vote. And that's what one of the main problems is with our law in Pennsylvania. It's pushing the eligibility for November of 2012. We make a major mistake. That mistake is we think everybody in this great country understands what we do every day in making laws. We think that everybody knows what we know. They don't. There are people out there that are sick that this is the last thing they're thinking about. There are people out there that are out of the state, out of the country, on vacation, dealing with their families, don't even know these laws exist. They're going to find out on November 6th that they do not qualify. That's what's wrong. Nobody's opposed to identifying the right person when they vote. I'm opposed to this because it's rushed through for this November. I'm with you if you want to have voter identification process where every voter in America is the right person that votes. But it can't be done in months. We're changing decades of a process where people vote because they know their neighbor, because it's their family, it's their friend. My uncle, who is 94, a World War II veteran, who fought in World War II, will be denied the right to vote because his driver's license has expired.
Do you have a question that you'd like the panel to react to?
No, the question might be, ma'am, why do we have to have it implemented in November 2012? Why can't it be in 13, 14, 15, or 16? Thank you.
Thank you.
May I address that?
Representative Harless?
I understand your concern about that. I will tell you our experience in Texas is this was not rushed through. We've been working on this for 6 years, and we actually passed our legislation in May of 2011. And there has been a lot of media coverage surrounding it. It has been put off because of the pre-clearance process, but we worked really hard to make sure ours wouldn't be rushed through. And it is 6 years of working on it and seeing what has worked in other states and what has not worked.
I appreciate that, but in Pennsylvania, it was done in March, and it's going to be implemented in November.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. Next question.
Hi, my name is Ray Lopez Calderon. I work with Common Cause. Question is probably mostly for Mr. Adams. I know that you said that we can pass laws in a prophylactic way because it's constitutionally possible. But I'd like to quote the great philosopher Chris Rock, who said, you probably could drive a car with your feet if you wanted to, but it doesn't make it a great idea. And I want to know why in states where we're facing great budget deficits, when there's zero, and you yourself said in many places there's no evidence, why we should be spending money on passing these laws, implementing these laws, changing decades of tradition on how we vote when there's zero evidence. Like what is the purpose if in fact
there's not
the
zero
evidence
evidence.
doesn't work?
I didn't say that, and that's not true for whoever does say it.
Next to no evidence on voter impersonation.
It's not next to no either. That's not true. As a matter of fact, in Pennsylvania, just to show you how these myths take hold, the Secretary of State entered a stipulation inexplicably that was not accurate. There were members of RNLA who have compiled evidence of in-person voter fraud impersonation in Pennsylvania. But the Secretary of State there issued the stipulation that the representative just told you. So it's not accurate to say there's next to no, that there's not massive. That is not true. Now, you raised the weightier issue that policymakers have to decide, is how important is election integrity? How important is it to not dilute a legitimate vote with an illegitimate one? That's not one that lawyers can answer. That's only one that policymakers can answer who've been elected. Independent groups like Common Cause can't answer. But I find it hard to believe that election integrity should fall so far down the list of priorities. If you pull out any state budget in this room, you're going to find all sorts of things that I think are not as important as election integrity. That's just my position.
And again, my question was in states where we have no evidence. I didn't say that there is no state that exists that might have evidence, but thank you.
Well, you know, if the state of Pennsylvania that had its interest in defending the law, you would think if there was evidence of voter impersonation, it would have brought to defend the law.
You would think that, but that,
hold on again.
But
again,
that question was directed to me.
Hold on, please.
You would
Mr.
think
Adams,
that there was evidence that they would do that, but
Mr. Adams, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. You talked about moving goalposts, and this is the whole thing. The RNLA had a map of massive voter fraud across the country, but when you parsed it down, the goalposts moved because it wasn't voter impersonation that was on that map. It was instances of electoral fraud, and he called me a vote fraud denier, but I think everyone's ears work in this room heard me at the beginning state that there are types of voter fraud that exist in this country. I'm not denying the fact that electoral fraud exists. I'm saying that the existence of voter impersonation is next to nothing in the state of Pennsylvania in defense of its law, whose interests were in bringing evidence of voter impersonation could not. So let's talk about moving goalposts.
Well, there's an editorial today in the Pittsburgh paper that deals with the Pennsylvania Secretaries of State, the Secretary of the Commonwealth, very poor decisions in that litigation. So to say that you would think that they would do certain things is not always the case. Obviously, members of RNLA had evidence that the Secretary of the Commonwealth was unaware of when she entered the stipulation. But just to clear up that map that it's been talked about now twice at RNLA, that map was merely to show 47 states have had some aspect of voter fraud. That map was not to show a massive conspiracy, a widespread conspiracy, greater than 9 conspiracy. That map was simply to show that almost every state has been touched in one way or another by voter fraud.
One state had voter impersonation.
Well, it wasn't a map to document all voter impersonation. It is a map to simply show that voter fraud is something that touches almost every part of the country.
I'm glad the goalposts have stayed in the same place.
And just one comment before. I just hope everyone's listening because that's important in this debate. And with all due respect to my colleagues, Mr. Adams, when there was a discussion about the testimony in the case that he handled, then you were directed to accept as truth what that individual testified to. But in a stipulation, which is essentially the same thing in a court proceeding, the suggestion to you is ignored. It's not true.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Thank you. I'm State Representative Mary Helen Garcia from the state of New Mexico, and I do chair Voters in Election, and our voter ID has been pending for a long time. No one on the panel addressed the voter ID that has to do with Native Americans. We have a large population of Native Americans in New Mexico, and this has not been addressed, and I'd like to hear an answer from any of you.
Well, the answer is to make tribal ID one of the forms which are acceptable. That's the easiest one. But let's make something else very clear. The answer to this problem is to get people voter ID. There's some folks on the web, I wish I could remember the name, these are folks who are against voter ID, but they have pivoted and turned their efforts to getting people voter ID as opposed to pushing back against the legislation. They realize voter ID is inevitable in many parts of the country. Voter ID should be free. It should be easy to get to. They should do like they did in Georgia. They will drive to your house and they will print it out right there at your doorstep. That's what there should be. And I know that comes with costs, but it should be free, easy, and perfectly available to anybody. That's the answer. It's not to have legislation that excludes people. And so I think in your particular instance, a tribal ID or having the government of New Mexico go to the reservations to make it easily accessible to people there.
It's not easy for Eva Steele, who's a resident of Arizona, whose son was deployed in Iraq, whose disabilities have left her in a wheelchair and unable to drive. She actually said, I don't have a driver's license. I don't get utility bills. I've never had a passport. I don't have property tax statements. All I did was raise my children and teach them to be good citizens and to vote. And now I'm the one who's on the outside looking in.
And I'm also trying to get an answer because a lot of this Native Americans do not have picture voter ID, and that is the concern because it has to do with whatever tribe they come from.
And I think you raise a valid point, and that's the question, that a lot of the legislation is drafted in a way that it only approves certain forms of identification, and that's the flaw in a lot of the bills. And the point I was making about whether you live in a licensed nursing home or don't, and why is there a distinction there, and why isn't federally issued or tribal issued identification just as significant an indicator of who you are than a state issued identification if you don't drive?
That's correct. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, and I'll make this quick because I see there's quite a line behind me still. The organization that I believe Mr. Adams was referring to is called Vote Riders. It's new, it's on the web, and it is trying to get people ID who don't currently have it, and that's certainly helpful. My name is Justin Levitt. I'm a professor of law at Loyola Law School in California, and in a former life, I was actually at the dreaded evil Brennan Center for Justice at MIT School of Law.
No, I just said they lack credibility. I didn't say they were evil.
No, that's true. That's true. You did say that. And because it's really easy to demonize somebody who's not in front of you, I only wanted to reemphasize...
No, I'm happy to debate you any moment on the Brennan Center's lack of credibility, Justin.
You can keep talking. But when I'm talking, I want to agree with you that it's very important for the people in the room to know the facts. And so I just want to offer, not here using up the real questions behind me, I just want to offer that all of the studies you heard about people who are actually potentially hurt and actually hurt by the strictest ID laws, and the studies about how much this costs, and the studies about how the incidence of real fraud that these sorts of laws could stop. I'm happy to discuss any of that with you in person, or by email or by phone, however you wish, and we can have that conversation. It's just I didn't want to leave the spooky talk unrebutted. So we can have that conversation. I'm happy to have it with anybody here in the room who actually wants to understand the facts behind.
Well, I didn't say spooky either, Justin. What I did was talk about some of the internal methodology of the study. So please be correct in your description of what I said.
I am happy to defend the credibility of the work, and more importantly, to point out where the work lives so that you can see it, and as Mr. Adams encouraged, judge it for yourself. So with that, I do want to leave to the other folks who are here.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Madison. I'm a committee counsel for the Council of the District of Columbia. I guess my question would probably be directed to Senator Counsel and Mr. Marshall, but one of the panelists can feel free to chime in. The title of this session is Voter ID, What's Next? And my question is, what is next? Do you all see voter ID laws as a slippery slope for other practices and other different types of laws that can lead to voter disenfranchisement?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, this debate is about voter ID, and voter ID has been the most popular topic of discussion this year when it comes to laws impacting our elections. But it's not just about voter ID across the country. In elections in 2008, citizens utilized early voting at high rates at jurisdictions across the country. And you saw in a state like Ohio, where in the 2004 elections, there were massive long lines and election breakdowns in that state. In 2006, the state implemented early voting, and in 2008, record numbers, particularly people of color, African-American voters, utilized early voting, and you saw less of the problems in Ohio that you had in previous elections. Fast forward to this year, the legislature fought a battle around election reform that included drastically shortening the window allowed for in-person early voting. That part was repealed, but what was not repealed was the fact that there would be a prohibition on voting over the last weekend. Now we have county boards of elections in areas, especially in urban areas in the state, that boards are taking votes to have extended hours to provide a service to voters that they see that's important to provide to lessen the burden of poll workers. And you're seeing a partisan tie vote on the need to extend hours to provide early voting, a proven method that helps to alleviate problems on Election Day. And the Republican Secretary of State, John Husted, has broken that tie in favor of reducing early voting hours in urban counties. But you have a situation in rural counties where the votes are taking place, where the Democrats are siding with Republicans in those rural counties to offer extended hours. So you have a number of areas in Ohio where urban voters, high turnout voters, have less access to early voting than they do in rural counties. You're also seeing in states like Florida where community registration groups, teachers who teach civic education are being prosecuted. Fortunately, the law is being blocked now, but limitations on the ability of community groups to register voters. The judge in that court actually said in the decision that if the only benefit of the law that he could see was the reduction in registration opportunities for minority voters. So you're seeing these actions that are limiting access as opposed to expanding access to the franchise. So it's not just about voter ID. There are limits on community registration. There are limits on early voting. We should be talking about, as I said before, solutions to the real problems in our system of elections that provide a secure voting system that is accessible for all Americans. And we're not having that discussion in many state houses across the country. And unfortunately, we're not having that discussion, that debate here on the panel today.
And I'd just like to echo the last part of Mr. Marshall's comments. What's next is let's address the real issues, and let's address those problems meaningfully in a way that does not have the effect, whether or not intended, the effect of suppressing the vote. I didn't share with the group some of the other things that were occurring in Nebraska at the time of the photo ID. Coincidentally, the Department of Motor Vehicles was deciding to close a number of its offices The first of which would have been in the area that serves the greatest number of elderly, poor, and minority voters. They were proposing to close that DMV, put it in excess of 15 miles away from that area of the city. So while you're talking about access to photo identification, you have what to some appears conspiratorial, because also at the same time, the county election commissioner in the largest county in Nebraska elected to close 50% of the polling places. So not only did you have the threat of photo ID, but you had the reality of limiting access to in-person voting. So the next step is let's be honest, let's be forthright, let's look at what the real issues are, and then craft legislation that's designed to address that and to expand access to voting as opposed to suppressing it.
Thanks. Thank you. We're going to take 3 more questions and then conclude the session. So the next question, please.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is Larry Gonzalez from the great state of Texas. I have a question regarding minority disenfranchisement. We hear a lot about minorities being disenfranchised. And my question for the panel, I know Texas's methodology and how that worked. My question is, nationwide, how is Hispanic being defined when you look at minority disenfranchisement? For an example, my wife is Anglo. Her name is Gonzalez. So a quick surname search to show that Marie Gonzalez is being disenfranchised is completely inaccurate because she is not Hispanic. So what steps do other states take to make sure that when you say minority disenfranchisement, that you're purely looking at minorities and not just a quick surname search that would produce people who may have a Hispanic surname but are not in fact Hispanic?
Well, I think any disenfranchisement is wrong. So disenfranchisement of a white voter is just as wrong as a disenfranchisement of a Latino voter. So it doesn't really matter who is being disenfranchised. Everyone should have access to the vote. But I think you're talking about a very narrow, casted example. When you look at the surveys and the methodology and voting across the country, I mean, I think that the one example you have is not really indicative of these surveys. Never mind the fact that 250,000 African-American voters that don't fit into the category you're talking about are also disenfranchised by this law. So I don't think that the question really gets to the root of the problem. Like I said, we're a nonpartisan organization. I think people should vote. Democrat, Republican. We're not talking about if Democrats support policy, which I did think was interesting that the Republican National Lawyers Association was touting Democratic support for legislation as a reason why it's good. That's the first time I've ever heard that. But it doesn't matter who you're voting for or what kind of voter you are. Everyone should have equal access to the vote. The fact that these skew towards communities of color makes it even more problematic.
Just to follow up, though, with due respect, I never mentioned Democrat or Republican, but you worked that in the conversation. But I'm talking about just Hispanic surnames, and that seems to be an issue that you're kind of hitting to, is because those kinds of issues get brought up when you talk about Hispanic surnames. And in Texas, that's not indicative of kind of who we are, just by definition. And it does matter. It does matter how they're categorized. And it's not just put aside very quickly. That's something that we looked at, because that is something that's very real where I live. Just as classification of Hispanic surname means Hispanic. So I'll yield the microphone.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, I just voted in Texas not too long ago. So I had a quick question to follow up for Ms. Harris and then Mr. Marshall. Ms. Harris, did you say 213 votes were cast in person by deceased registered voters? If that was correct, and just where that information came from, because that...
This was information from the trial the week of July the 9th through the 13th. There were 239 votes cast in the May election, and of those 200, I can't find the exact number right now, 213 were in person.
Okay. And then as a follow-up for Mr. Marshall, I know that Lawyers Committee is very active. Are they doing anything for these people they've identified, these unfortunate people that are going through life without any kind of identification and having difficulty getting federal benefits and just interacting within their states? As the Lawyers Committee, do they have like a charitable organization to help these people? we could contribute to?
So I'll answer your question directly, and then I want to raise the specter of these dead people that have been voting. In every instance when these have been raised, there are legitimate reasons why that it appears that dead people are voting when you actually look, it's not the case. One, there is early voting in person in Texas, so it's legitimate to understand that some of those voters actually voted and unfortunately did not make it to Election Day. There are also faulty list matching where people have same last name, same names. Eric Marshall is a very common name. It is not without reason to understand that someone could have had a similar name to someone that was deceased and an election official marked that name wrong. When you go into a polling place, there are poll workers who are hardworking Americans committed to this democracy, but sometimes they make mistakes, and oftentimes the names have been signed in the wrong lines of the poll books. This is what happened in South Carolina. Was actually an exhaustive analysis of this. There were 953 potential cases of dead people voting in the 2010 elections in South Carolina. When the election authority did analysis, that's exactly what they found. Clerical errors, people signing the wrong names, people who died after they cast their ballot, and it showed that there was actually zero credible evidence of any dead people voting. So I think it's important you hear these numbers to actually think through the issue and what it means, that just because you spout out that number does not mean that 213 dead people lifted up from the grave and limped to the polling place and voted. And your second point is, yes, the Lawyers Committee, through our work in election protection, we're doing a lot of work to help support voters, to educate them what they need. We're actually about to launch a smartphone application that will allow voters to get access to the voting rules, including identification rules in their state, and contact us. We have a hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, where voters can call any time of the year with any questions or problems, and we have voter ID toolkits and voter ID information so that if a voter does not have ID while we oppose the implementation of these laws, we want to make sure everyone can comply with the rules. And so we do walk through the process. We work with groups in Wisconsin and Tennessee and other states that are helping people get ID and working with them. We are a 501c3 organization. You can make tax-exempt contributions through our website at lawyerscommittee.org or our election protection website at 866ourvote.org. So we definitely encourage you to do that, and I appreciate that.
But if I wanted to donate just for ID for people that just don't have the means.
Yeah, we do it broadly. I know there's a group, as Justin Levitt mentioned, Vote Riders. They have a website, voteriders.org. They also are doing work in states to directly assist people get ID. And there are different groups in different states, like in Wisconsin, the League of Women Voters is doing a lot of work and actually helping to fund people get IDs. League of Young Voters in Texas and in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are doing work to get people ID. So those are a couple of groups, League of Women Voters, League of Young Voters, Vote Riders are a few organizations that if you're looking for that direct service, you can support them.
Well, then as a follow-up, has your organization looked at how long or what kind of resource it would take to get it for all of these people?
We have not.
Okay.
Mr. Marshall, I want to ask, so the information that was presented by the Attorney General's office and the federal court at the trial in July, the 213 dead people that voted in the election, are you saying some of those died from the time they early voted, or do you have information about that subset of numbers?
I'm simply stating that oftentimes you look at that,
okay,
that's happened, and in South
Carolina
that I know of the case.
Clarify that you don't have information on the Texas numbers, please.
I don't have information on the Texas numbers,
thank you.
But I do have information on other places with attorney generals who have submitted that for evidence, and that was South Carolina. I'm sure.
The question was about Texas.
Okay, you know what? I'll look it up, and we'll find out the information. I'm sure we can. I'm sure. I will bet you a beverage that we will find that there were not 213 incidences of dead people voting in the state of Texas.
All right, thank you. Let's take the last question.
Okay.
Please.
Please let him ask his question as well. I am Delegate Carol Miller, and I am from West Virginia, and I have Lincoln County in my, well, I have a couple comments that I want to make and a question or two. Have any of you talked to county clerks before you've come to any of these conclusions? Because this is a difficult thing to do. We've had, since the last census, we changed around where our polling places were, and it has made it extremely difficult for some of the older people to vote. Are there any requirements or legislation done in any other states of how long you take before you put a dead person off the voting? I mean, how are these reported back to your county clerks? Say grandma who lives in Hamlin, West Virginia, for instance, is staying with her granddaughter in Pennsylvania, and she dies in Pennsylvania, how long does it take for her name to get back to her county of origin that she is A, dead, or B, going to be taken off of these rolls? Are there requirements for these things? And I also do want to ask Senator Council, we have changed our licensings in the DMV, and it's become extremely difficult. And I've had more women complain to me than men because you have to bring in so many pieces of identification just to re-up your license, even if you've driven since you were 15 or 16. All of a sudden, if you've had one or two husbands or whatever, you have to have so many pieces of identification. I wonder in your state if you've had this problem. And I also want to point out, we have more people with driver's licenses in West Virginia than we do have registered voters. So I want you to think about all these things, and please give me any comments you can. But don't disenfranchise this gentleman.
And to the question that you directed to me, I only have anecdotal evidence. I've had women who approached me who their driver's license has their married name and their voter registration has their maiden name. And that has created a problem in terms of what kind of documentation do they need to obtain, your marriage license, and who do you present that to? But there is a cost associated with it because you're going to have to go. You have to change one or the other. And if they want to drive under their married name, they're going to have to go change their voter registration from the maiden name. But those issues do come up, and there are situations where with the female, where they are registered under their married name and have since divorced. and those kinds of problems are encountered about what evidence they need to present to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get those things changed. And it is burdensome, and that was the point I was trying to make earlier. I mean, there's no dispute that there are constitutional ways to enact voter identification. The question is what's the cost and what's the burden on the voter? And most of the voter ID laws, and particularly the one that was introduced in Nebraska, was going to impose an incredible burden on our seniors and those living in poverty.
I just quickly want to add, in Texas, we did add an exception to that said in our legislation that if the names were similar or substantially similar, and anticipating women that show up with a new married name on a driver's license and their voter registration is still in their maiden name, they can cast a ballot and the ballot would be counted.
You're blessed with one of the most proactive secretaries of state in the country who's working hard, as you probably know, even in Lincoln County to fix this problem. And really, there's a couple solutions. One is, as Virginia has done, the State Board of Elections has purchased something that most states have not, and that's the Social Security Death Index. And they're running their registrations up against a death index. And when you find someone who's dead, you can immediately remove them from the rolls, even under motor voter. A dead means immediately off the rolls. So that's one way that another state is dealing with this. Now, I understand that costs money to get the Social Security Death Index, but that's one way that a sister state's doing it.
And that puts the burden back on the county clerk again.
And indeed, and perhaps Secretary Tennant could talk to SBE of Virginia to figure out a more cost-effective way of doing it, because West Virginia is one of the problems, as you know, in Lincoln, with the rolls. I mean, I think Lincoln had about 107% of total voting age pop on the rolls not too long ago.
It sure would be great if we talked about modernizing voter registration to actually provide solutions to the problems that you discuss. And hopefully, as we move forward, those will be discussions I can join my colleagues in this table in talking about that actually address the issues of inaccuracies within the voter rolls.
Okay, thank you all for your questions. Please give the panelists a round of applause. And if you're using the NCL app, please fill out the survey. Thank you for coming.
sometime, Eric.